Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out today. It's warm weather. The heat came back. I'm Oscar Garza. I'm the senior producer of a show called The Frame at KPCC. It's a daily arts and culture show that airs at 3:30 and 7 p.m. every weekday. And we are putting on some talks that are related to Pacific Standard Time, both here and a few other places around the city that I'll tell you about in a little bit more. But first, on behalf of KPCC, I want to welcome you to the Intimate Theater at the Luckman Fine Arts Complex here at Cal State LA. Today's program is related to the show that is opening today. In fact, it opens right after we're done here, and you're all invited to go to the reception. That show is Disney's Latin America and Latin America's Disney. The precedent of that is How to Read Pato Pascual. I just want to mention that this event is put on by KPCC and my colleagues at Downstage, which is KPCC. Well, KPCC in person are my colleagues who put on these events. This one's known as Downstage, and I also, of course, want to acknowledge Pacific Standard Time, which is already kind of up and running around the region. Just a couple of things before we get started. Please take a moment to find the nearest emergency exit. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. We will be doing a short audience Q&A. We'll squeeze some time in for some questions. When the time comes for that, raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you, and then you can ask your question. It's okay to use your cell phones. We just ask that you leave them on silent mode, please. We also invite you to engage with us on social media using the hashtag #downstage. Photos are okay, but please no flash and no audio or video recording. This event is supported in part by the California Arts Council, and you can find more information about them at www.arts.ca.gov. A couple of other events that KPCC is doing as part of the series. There's going to be one on September 23rd. My colleagues at the show Take Two are doing something at La Plaza related to the show that's opening there called Murales Rebeldes, how Chicano murals in LA have been censored, whitewashed, neglected, and even destroyed. That's on the 23rd. And then on the 25th, The Frame is doing the first in a series of events that we're going to do with the Academy of Motion Pictures. They are doing a series of film screenings of movies about Los Angeles and Latin America and the intersection of those two. The first one is on Monday, September 25th. It's at the Academy in Beverly Hills, and they're going to be screening Zoot Suit, and Luis Valdez and Edward James Olmos will be there to be on the panel, part of that screening. And it will be hosted by the host of The Frame, John Horn, who's going to moderate today's program. And here's John.
Good afternoon and welcome. Has anybody ever seen a radio program recorded before? Okay, good. No, those people work at KPCC, so that doesn't count. I'm kidding. So we're going to talk for as long as it's interesting, maybe 30, 35 minutes, and then we'll take questions from you all. And if you listen to this show later, we'll edit it down to a very nice package. So you get to see the before and after and the during. So I want to welcome our panel who have taken time out to share their thoughts, their experience, and their wisdom. First, the director of the documentary film Walton El Grupo, Ted Thomas. Second, an artist who teaches at UC Irvine, Mari Angeles Solo Diaz. And then the co-curators of How to Read El Pato Pascual, Disney's Latin America and Latin America's Disney, Ruben Ortiz Torres and Jesse Lerner. Welcome. Bienvenidos. I'm going to start with Ruben and Jesse. I want to ask you a little bit about the background of what led you to this show. You both have been exploring Disney's influence for a long time. Ruben, in 1991, you made a film called How to Read Macho Mouse. And in 1995, the two of you collaborated on the documentary Frontierland. So if you can think back about the earliest time you started thinking about what you could bring as artists to understanding Walt Disney, what was the initial conversation and what was the initial inspiration for the first project?
Right. The first time I came to California was in 1972, and I went to Disneyland. I also have cousins in San Diego. However, I remember Disneyland very well. I don't even remember that there was a city attached to Disneyland. I don't remember Los Angeles, for example. Later on, I came to study to the California Institute of the Arts. I was a Fulbright scholar, and I got a scholarship to go there. And as you guys might know, or perhaps you guys don't know, but CalArts is actually a school that is funded, and it was funded by Walt Disney, right? And so, you know, when I was in CalArts, some of the work that I had done in Mexico involved popular culture and a dialogue with popular culture, some kind of revision of popular culture, criticism. So one of my teachers, who was Michael Asher, told me to read this essay that is called How to Read Donald Duck, that I remember I had seen as a kid in my house. However, when I saw the essay in my house, I thought it was a comic book because it had cartoons. So I wanted to read it, and then it was this very, you know, this Marxist critique on the on the comic books, right? Which in Mexico at the time were relatively common because there were also these cartoons, these comic books produced by this guy Rios that also dealt with subject matter using comic books. So I read it, and I thought, but then I never thought that coming to the United States, that book would become relevant, or that it would be brought to me again. When I read the book for the second time with Michael, I was sort of critical. I mean, I thought that the book had a point, but at the same time, I was going often to Tijuana, and I would see that a lot of the way this iconography was used was not exactly the way, well, first of all, it was used by the local people, and not in the way that the book would claim these icons would work. So then I was very interested in that, and how people use these icons for their own purposes. And then I started producing a series of paintings and photographs and videos. That video that you mentioned is part of them, which Jesse saw. And then that's how I actually met Jesse, because of that video. And then at some point, we also wanted to work on a movie. And I guess I would let Jesse to talk from then. Yeah.
Well, we had created this documentary film collaboration called Fronterilandia, which was looking at these different cultural exchanges back and forth between Mexico and the United States, a Mexican version of U.S. culture, a U.S. version of Mexican culture, a Mexican version of a U.S. version of Mexican culture. And in the course of making that film, there were several points where we ran into these, it's not uncommon in walking down the street of a major metropolis in Latin America to see either some licensed Disney product or some unlicensed appropriation, right?
A lot more appropriation than license,
Yes.
right? Yes.
A lot of nursery schools or daycare centers will have a mural outside or inside with a misshapen Mickey and Minnie or something like that. So in the course of making that film, there were several oblique references to both the unauthorized and the authorized Latin American incarnations of Disney characters. And I guess the other thing I'd mentioned that sort of functions as an antecedent is that with the first Pacific Standard Time, when was that, 6 years ago, Ruben and I collaborated on this exhibition called MEX-LA at the Museum of Latin American Art, which was looking at Mexican artists working in Los Angeles, Southern California artists working in Mexico, Chicano artists, and sort of tracing that history from the 30s to the 80s. And we were able to go to the Disney archives and borrow some of the sketches and studies that were done for the Three Caballeros and the Saludos Amigos, as well as a couple of the didactic films to include in that show.
I want to ask you about Frontierland, because Frontierland was a part of the theme park at Disneyland, and it could have easily been called Imperialism Town or Manifest Destiny Land. It was really about conquering. It was about colonizing. And was that intentional in your part to name your film Frontierland, to kind of appropriate the name that they were appropriating from conquest?
Well, I remember we sat down and had this brainstorming session and wrote out 20 different titles, and each one had its pros and cons, and we ended up, it does have a Disneylandia sort of resonance, Fronterilandia, And it also seemed like the film was about these it was less about the sort of economic base of, it was made around the time when the free trade agreement, NAFTA, was signed, but it wasn't looking at so much the economics or the politics of U.S.-Mexican relations as it was these representations of each country or some imaginary third country that's neither Mexico nor the United States.
So let's now turn to the show that you've curated that's both here and at the Max Center. And let's start with watching a clip from the documentary, Ted, that you made called Walt and El Grupo.
So the government came to me about that time. They wanted me to go to South America to build up our relationship down there. They wanted me to go down kind of representing the cultural side under the State Department, the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. They wanted me to just go on a tour. I said, no, I'm no good at that. I said, I can't do that. So then they came back and they said, well, will you go down and make some pictures? Go down and see if you can find something that you can make about those countries. I said, we're basically interested in what we call the ABC countries. It's Argentina, Brazil, Chile. I said, well, yes, I'd like to do that. I said, that could be stimulating. I think we could get something interesting out of that. I said, I'd feel better about going down and really doing something instead of going down and shaking a hand. Well, I was right in the hands of the bank. And the bank said, well, how do we know Walt can make anything about South America? How do we know that they just turn out to be propaganda things and wouldn't be worth a darn in the theater? So the government says, we'll gamble on Walt.
The trip and the production of films that came afterward were both underwritten by the government, which is to say the trip was paid for, and there was a guarantee on the films that if the films that they made to support this mission didn't make money, they were underwritten and guaranteed by the government.
That's an amazing idea that the U.S. government would guarantee the financial success of a film for a company that was certainly in business for making money. So before we talk about the film itself, we should talk about the world into which this trip happened. So this is, 1941? The U.S. government has an agenda here that maybe lines up with Walt Disney's agenda. What was the U.S. government trying to promote through trips like this?
Well, Nelson Rockefeller, whose family had lots of financial interests in South America, came back from a visit and told his friends in Washington, there's growing fascist and Nazi influence throughout Latin America. And when World War II eventually comes to this hemisphere, it sure would be a good idea if the nations of Latin America were on the Allies' side rather than on the Axis side. And this got the ear of FDR, who appointed Nelson Rockefeller as the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs. And it was sort of a mini State Department that was under the Department of Commerce, actually. And for a couple of years, made big strides in terms of setting up a new steel factory for Brazil and having cultural exchange with several countries in Latin America, doing lend-lease arrangements on ships, arranging for commodities, treaties with Chile, things like that. And they tapped Hollywood studios to make projects with Latin American themes, with the idea that it would introduce Latin America to American audiences. And so Americans in general would be more open and sympathetic to what was going on in Latin America. But after a couple of disastrous trips made by Hollywood stars, they realized, well, maybe we ought to get somebody who can really represent the U.S. And so they called on Walt Disney, whose staff had already been researching a series of films. You saw in the clip there that they had already come up with some ideas of what projects they might do in different countries. And so when they went, they were prepared. They knew something about the cultures of each of the countries, something about the people and the languages. But Walt Disney was very reluctant to go if it hadn't been for the fact that, one, he would get to make some films, and number two, believe it or not, Walt Disney was on the verge of bankruptcy. He had made a whole lot of money with Snow White, but everything after Snow White had been money out the door. Built a new studio, made Pinocchio, which was not a success when it came out, made Fantasia, which was not a success when it came out, was working on Bambi, which was not a success when it came out, and he owed so much money that if he hadn't gotten this project going, he probably would have gone out of business.
So the U.S. government has what I think we can clearly say was a propaganda initiative that they thought Walt Disney could be an ambassador for. What was Walt Disney's cultural interest in Latin America? Was he looking for a new market into which to sell his films, or did he want to represent Latin American culture through his own films and speak to Latin Americans in the United States? What was his business initiative that he thought he could benefit from?
Well, he was in the business of making entertainment for as many people as he could. And the interesting thing about the way he went about making his films is that they were phenomenally successful around the world. And very early on, he was very good at migrating his artists from one position to another. And he got one fellow who was okay at animation, but he was much better at dubbing the films into different languages. And so he became responsible. His name was John Cutting. He became responsible for developing contacts in different countries where the films could be dubbed into Portuguese or Argentine Spanish or Chilean Spanish. And so he served as an advance man for this Latin American trip.
And I think in many ways, the mention of Rockefeller kind of figures into the larger story here, because Ariel Dorfman, who is the co-author of How to Read Donald Duck, writes in an introduction to the essay that the essay was in large part written based about what was happening in Chile and about the ways in which the economy was controlled by the likes of Nelson Rockefeller. So I guess the next question is, did that trip have a role in kind of laying the groundwork for the show that you have now in terms of Disney's influence in Latin America and Latin America's influence in Disney? Without that trip, might we have a different show showing right around the corner now?
No, sure. Probably we wouldn't even have a show, to be honest with you, because we wouldn't have the movies that would prompt. Well, I mean, I suppose artists probably would have responded to Disney still, because obviously these characters are very well known. But certainly, for example, if you look at all the participation we have from Brazilian artists, pays a specific reference to Joe Carioca. In Brazil, is known as Zé Carioca. There are very specific pieces about that. In fact, in ways that because there's also Pancho Pistoles, which I actually like a lot, the character. But in Mexico, I don't think any artist really has addressed that or made anything about that. Although we have pieces specific about the Three Caballeros. So I obviously think that it had that obviously has an influence. But the one thing that I also would like to point out, since you are comparing that particular experience with the essay of Dorfman, is how these two moments represent these two very difficult politics that the United States constantly. There's this cycle where you have the good neighbor policy. And then I guess I would call it the bad neighbor policy, which is this
the overthrow of an democratically elected government in Chile. Yes, I would say so. Yes,
or invading the Dominican Republic.
Okay,
or Guatemala.
Or Mexico or Guatemala.
I guess the argument would have been that the Cold War was what would provoke this, but the reality is that historically you have seen these cycles, and which right now we're experiencing again, right? After I would say that NAFTA was a way to, we got funding, Jesse and me, to make a movie, because of NAFTA in a way. There was a possibility to create a new economic cooperation, right? And then now we go back to this other discourse of fear and aggression, I suppose.
Bad hombres.
I like to say that the United States rediscovers Latin America about once a generation.
I think that's true. Maria, I want to talk about your work, because there's work that's new for this show, and there's work that dates back to the 1970s. How did you come to have a piece in the show, and what were the initial conversations you had, either with the curators or on your own, about what you wanted to represent? And by the way, do we have a slide of that? I think we do. Do we have? Yeah, let's bring the house lights down so we can see a little bit of your work, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about what we're seeing here?
Sure. For this show, I took the idea of the recently released Latina princess who is Elena. And Elena is described as this fiery, bold, daring princess. And she was released to the market without a feature film, last year. And so there is a peculiar thing about her, which is that she has a magic wand, and the magic wand debilitates her body every time she uses it. And so for the work here, I took the idea of a reimagined story of this princess, Elena. And so instead of holding a magic wand, she's holding a pencil torch. And I purchased on Craigslist a toy castle, princess castle, and I burned it. But the burning is prefaced by a kind of meditation on the castle, and so so it's a kind of performance where I'm filming myself doing it, and I created this video that is a close-up of this castle. And after I burned the castle, I sliced pieces of the castle and I adhered them to the works and that you see in the installation. So basically, one of the things that happened, when I was invited to participate, was that I tried to find my way into the subject matter. And I remember when I was little, I encountered Disney in various ways, and one way was through the stories that were very evocative, and I remember listening to the stories very attentively, and some of the early stories, the ones that didn't make a lot of money, like the Bambi stories, Dumbo, and the 101 Dalmatians, and all these stories that to me were kind of quirky and interesting. And then at a certain point, the early princesses were introduced to the market, and I felt a sense of alienation when I encountered them, and so I felt like I needed to revisit that theme of the princess in distress, needing to be saved by a charming prince. And so here, there is a kind of feminist take on the princess, where she appropriates the story to make it her own. Another aspect that came into play for this installation is the context. It was a site-specific It's a site-specific installation at the Max Center for Art and Architecture, and the house is quite beautiful. It's a modernist icon, and I was struck by two things in particular, or actually three, from my researching the house. And one of them was that particular room that I was given had the function of being a nursery. And so, with that comes this kind of understanding that there is a lot of socialization that takes place for children, and play, through play. And so I started to think about, the way, gender is inculcated at an early age through the specific games that parents purchase for the kids. And so that was one aspect. The other aspect was the beautiful windows that give a lot of light, natural light, onto the room. And so I wanted to capitalize on that, on the light. And the other thing that also was important for this was the absence of the movie of the large screen was something that then made it into the painting. So you'll see that.
And this is in West
But-
Hollywood, is that right?
Yeah, it's in West Hollywood.
So after you watch,
Yeah.
after you look at the exhibit here, you go to West Hollywood and you get the 1-2 punch.
Yeah. The other aspect that really impacted me about the house was the fact that it has 7 fireplaces. So fire is a prominent element in the architecture of the house, and so I took the element of fire and folded it into the work itself.
Ted, when you look at some of the art that these people have created, how do you think it bookends to the film that you made, and what does one have to say about the other? How does that conversation unfold in your mind?
Well, it's very interesting. I think that a lot of the really stimulating art that's in the exhibition here keys more off of the success of the Disney company consumer products bonanza that they have around the world than it does necessarily off of the achievements of the filmmakers, particularly the artists who were on this 1941 trip. And although I do think there was a terrific amount of back and forth at that time, and a lot of goodwill that was created out of that trip too.
I mean, like Liliana Porter's photographs of people wearing like Disney T-shirts or the Disney characters at various events that Liliana's documenting, things like that.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's and it really, her work really homes in on this wonderful cross-cultural mishmash that comes out of the Disney consumer products influences around the world, and then reflected in the environment that her characters are in.
I think we have another clip from the film. Is that right? Let's take another look at what happens to Walt Disney when he goes to South America.
This group of artists demonstrated Argentine folk dances for us on the roof of the Alvear Palace Hotel, where our Buenos Aires studio was located. They were directed by Professor Chazareta, an authority on music and dances of the Argentine. Everyone agreed that this was the perfect type of research, entertaining as well as instructive.
My next question is for Ruben and Jesse and Maria Angeles. What did you take away from this documentary? What did it show you that maybe surprised you or changed your way of thinking about the Walt Disney Company?
Well, I think it's important to note that in
Closer to your mic.
in the pre-production of that film, there was this sort of moment of collaboration and exchange. Some of the artists ended up really directly inspiring certain sequences, like the Molina Campos sequence, and the Gaucho, the Goofy Gaucho has this very direct relationship, and then other times it seems like it's more of this sort of brainstorming session where people sit down together. And you mentioned that that Disney's team met Roberto Brull Marx, right, this important modernist landscape architect, and so you can't say that there's a direct quotation of his work in the film, but it's more of just this sort of brainstorming moment of, let's sit down together and share ideas and see where this leads us.
Yeah, I think that this idea that influence is a kind of one-way street where the imperialist power is on top, and then the third world is on the bottom. I think it's a fallacy. I think that when you really look at the creative process, you see that there's a lot of kind of back and forth, but also I always think of this term the cultural appropriation, but more complicated, called anthropophagia, which generated out of Brazil. And it's the digestion of all these different cultural forces that then create something new and interesting. So it's kind of this postmodern sensibility that in Latin America we've always had. So it's not like, it's like a top-down situation. And to me, this was one of the most exciting things, in being part of the show, was this this sense that you're kind of the curators, Jesse and Ruben and Fabian, were interested in kind of looking at this issue of influence and how Disney is present in a very interesting kind of complex way, and really putting the power back into in the artists, or the agency back into the creative work.
And I think it's worth pointing out that Dorfman wrote years later, sort of reflecting back on his collaboration with Matalat, How to Read Donald Duck, that perhaps they had underestimated the sort of question of reception, that the audience isn't simply this passive object that receives the information, but also then reappropriates it, misinterprets it, reuses it, and does something else with it.
Exactly. And I think that, that's really important to understand, that, this idea of influence, the top-down influence, actually is a kind of form of colonialism to think that way, because then you're thinking that developing or quote unquote developing countries don't have a kind of don't have agency in their creative process.
And out of the trip, the trip had a profound influence on all the members of El Grupo. The most striking ones are probably Mary Blair, who found her voice on this trip, and she's known very well later as the stylist for the film Alice in Wonderland and the entire attraction. It's a Small World at the Disney theme parks. But she was also a very prolific Golden Book illustrator during the 1950s, and also a commercial artist. And the style that she developed really was catalyzed by this South American trip and what happened in Brazil and Argentina. And her particular group then came up the West Coast through Bolivia, Peru, and up through Mexico. And she subsequently also worked on the Three Caballeros film and took another trip to Mexico, and then a third one to Cuba, where there was going to be a third Good Neighbor film, but World War II ended, and the support for those films ended with it. So.
We should pause and just say the idea of the United States having an initiative with people south of the border called the Good Neighbor Program is more than a little ironic today. But there's also a theory too, and I don't know how much it's held, how much it's recognized or held in dispute. That is that there was, I think, a colleague of Diego Rivera who spoke on the Disney campus. There's a theory that Donald Duck was in fact based on a pre-Columbian duck image that this colleague of Diego Rivera showed to Disney employees. So it could be that Disney was appropriating pre-Columbian art from south of the border. We don't know.
And Rivera himself was a big admirer of Donald Duck and wrote this, and Mickey Mouse, and he writes this short text that was published in the 1930s in the United States, where he says that, after the proletarian revolution and all the art that we're making seems, like this archaic fossil from an earlier age, the one thing that will survive will be Disney cartoons.
That's probably true. Now, the Walt Disney Company, when it comes to its intellectual property, is famously litigious and very protective of the ways in which its characters are used, generally in commercial means, but sometimes in artistic means. As artists working with Disney imagery, have you had experience where they have been receptive to letting artists use their iconography, or has it been a situation sometimes where they're saying you can't do that with our intellectual property? How would you describe your kind of relationship to their intellectual property?
Well, I suppose most of the art that we have here is protected by the First Amendment in the sense that it's ironic, it often has a political commentary, and so there's these protections. However, the instance that is more clear where there was a conflict was actually with the edition of the book in English of the essay of Dorfman and Matalat. From what I've heard, I haven't heard of the artists that we work with. I haven't heard directly about an issue of censorship or of litigation. But with Dorfman and Matalat, the book actually which was edited by this guy, Seth Siegeloff in New York, who's also very well known in the art world because he had the first gallery that promoted conceptual art. But Siegeloff didn't make much money, and then he wanted to make. He started printing books, right? And so he started printing books that had to do with communication and semiotics. Mm-hmm. And so he translated the book of the how to read Donald Duck in English. And when the book was printed in England, when the book came to the United States, it was a stop at customs. And he had to fight Disney.
The book,
yes.
Wow.
Because the book was, there were, I guess the big issue is that there were those, actually, it's funny because those cartoons that attracted me as a kid that make me think that it was a comic book to read, here, that was the problem. It's like, well, Disney didn't want him to use the cartoon characters, right? Because the comic book, but then they argued that they were necessary to understand the critique, right? That you have to see those cartoons to understand what was happening in the essay. So at the end, he won the lawsuit. Actually, said Siegeloff, and Disney lost. And
Disney Studio has published a book called, I believe it's called The Art of Mickey Mouse, with reproductions of works by Andy Warhol and Lichtenstein and Oldenburg and all these US-based pop artists that have Disney iconography in their work. So perhaps what we're doing is adding the Latin American chapter, although you could argue that with the Warhol Mickey, it's a little more ambivalent, and here perhaps the political critique is more pointed. So.
Mm-hmm. I would like to add just one comment. Sure. When you guys probably have heard that there's this movie called Coco that is going to come out, and it's about the Day of the Dead, and Disney is producing it. At some point, Disney attempted to copyright the Day of the Dead, and and as you guys can imagine, we're laughing, but it was a scary moment, at least to me. It didn't work out. I mean, it actually was like a public.
Christmas was already trademarked. Is that the problem?
It didn't work out. But,
I think there's a really interesting image that's on display over at the Mack Center, and that's a photograph of it's a mate tigor that I think has the image of Che Guevara on it, and next to it is Minnie Mouse. And I thought, well, this brought to my mind the whole idea of how personalities and characters get mythologized to the point that Che Guevara is now as much a commercial commodity as Mickey Mouse is, True. And it's a fascinating, I mean, our desire to mythologize things and people. There are three myths we were talking about this before the recording, three myths in Argentina that came out of the 1941 trip. One myth is that Disney got the idea for Disneyland from República de los Niños. Mm-hmm. And the second one is that he's frozen. And the third one is that he slept in this cabin in a forest in Patagonia and got the brainstorm to make Bambi. And there's a plaque on the cabin, and it's a tourist site that is run by the Argentine government to this day. And you can ask anybody from Argentina, and they're amazed to find out that Bambi was already completed.
When he came. Yeah. Still a good story as long as it sells tickets. Before we get to audience questions, I want to end with one last thing, and that is CalArts. And CalArts is a school that was founded by Walt Disney and clearly has, to this day, a lot of Disney family influence and support. How important to the artists here is CalArts, and will it continue to be in bringing new voices and bringing forth new artists who are going to continue this conversation that we're having here and that's in the galleries here and in West Hollywood?
Well, I mean, our show is mostly it's artists from Latin America. So actually, I don't believe any of them. But I mean, I guess other than Maria Angeles, right? You went to CalArts.
There you go.
It's interesting. Maria Angeles and of course myself, right, as a curator. I mean, for me, it's obviously important. And because these discussions that we're having right now, I had them with my teachers. I had them with Asher and Alan Sekula. Mm-hmm. but at the same time, I guess it's for me, it's just interesting that how Disney, what happened with CalArts is probably a little bit of what happens with this iconography, because he thought of the school that it was going to be something, that it would be, for example, this idea, and I don't know if it's another myth, but I heard that it's located in Valencia because tourists that would come from Northern California to Los Angeles, or the other way around, from Southern California to Northern California, could stop in CalArts to buy art from the students, right?
Because it's right on the interstate, right on
Because it's
Interstate
the
5.
interstate, which is sounds like a very strange idea to me. But well, all these plans that Disney had, he died, and then eventually in the 60s, during the Vietnam War, what you really got is this very combative school, with all these hippies that were doing political art. Right? So
An interesting footnote to this is that several of the members of El Grupo went to Chenard's, which was the art school precursor to CalArts, right? And Herb Ryman, who is also one of the people of El Grupo, was a tireless fundraiser for CalArts. And even now, there's a Ryman Arts Foundation which promotes art education, hands-on art education here in the Los Angeles area.
And the irony is people who stop in Valencia where CalArts is are going to Magic Mountain. So they're getting off the freeway. They're just not buying artwork. Let's have some audience questions. There's a microphone that we'll pass around. So if you have an audience question, wait till you get a microphone. Try to make them brief and identify who you have a question for, and then we'll wrap this up. Who would like to get started? Don't be shy. Somebody put their hand up. There you go, right there.
Ruben, what do you think the Walt Disney Company is trying to accomplish by doing things like copyrighting the Day of the Dead?
well, I think it's very simple. I think they want to get some money out of it. Well, who owns culture, right? I really think that culture it's not an individual endeavor. It's a collective endeavor. We're all making it, and it requires exchange, and it requires cultural centers are all. If you think about Paris or New York, have been important because they have been open, because people have been able to come in and out. Paris was able to receive Picasso, and New York was able to receive Duchamp, and a lot of other artists. So I think Southern California is right now in a position to become an important cultural center because it's a meeting point. So this idea of owning things or co-opting those things, well, again, as I said, well, they wanted to market their movie and they wanted to do that, but at the same time, as you can see, it's way more complicated. By doing that, they would just open a floodgate for people to interact with whatever they're. And I'm sure that when the movie comes, we could make probably in the future another show about what artists will do about that movie.
I'll give you a sequel.
A sequel, yeah.
Do you have something to add? Go ahead.
Well, I think that one of the interesting things that the show Disney's Latin America raises is the issue of transculturation and cultural appropriation, but seen from an angle that is not just power play, between a powerful nation and an underdeveloped, nation, and I think that that's really important to emphasize. I think because not everything can be reduced to strong economic interests. I think that there is a lot more that goes into play, and I think sometimes yes, sure, the economic interests do play a role, but I think it's it's important to look at all the other ways in which other things can escape it. Creative agency, for one. Yeah.
We have time for a couple more questions in the way back. Go ahead.
In the interest of animation and the animated feature as a medium, and also having their own studios in Latin America, I'm wondering if anyone had anything to offer about their experience and their research in looking at different American studios such as Universal or Hanna-Barbera or iWorks or someone who had better success or different success in Latin America, and also if other studios in Latin America what was the interaction there with the United States as far as the Latin American and the American animation industry?
You mean in 1941 or more?
I'm interested in that period just for
Well,
focusing.
in
but whatever you wanna say.
1941, Brazil did not have an animation industry. Argentina had a nascent one. You know, it was just trying to get off the ground. There had been a fellow named Cristiani who had immigrated from Italy, who had made a feature film completely on his own, animated film. And there was another film that was being worked on based upon a very popular Argentine Indian character that had been a comic strip, and it was being turned into a film. And then in Chile, there were a couple of film students who were making their own animated film project. And in both places, the Disney artists had, I wouldn't call it a master class, but they got together and talk shop with the animators. But subsequent to that, I mean, the industries struggled because there just wasn't enough capital to put behind animated films. And it wasn't until television became more prevalent and then TV animation came in that you started having more healthy industries in each of those countries. Now there's great animation coming out of all of those countries.
And there's a little bit of animation in Mexico in the 1930s. Not a whole lot, but I do remember seeing this one short with a sort of anthropomorphic animal that goes to the pyramids. And in the pyramid, there are these skeletons that come to life, a little bit like Disney's Skeleton Dance, but with this pre-Columbian touch to it, and a hyper-Mexican landscape of, you know, to get to the pyramids, it's all like nopales and, you know, serpents and eagles and so on and so forth. It's pretty great.
Does anybody have one more question? If you do not, I want to, oh wait, back in the corner, last question. Thank you.
Because you are focusing on ABC, and I'm just wondering what was going on here in LA for the Mexican community as they're looking at these images now of South America. What was going on as far as representation in the Mexican culture by Disney?
Well, it's worth pointing out that the Mexican dance sequences, which are set in Veracruz, were shot here in Hollywood with a group, it's like a ballet folklorico that was based in Claremont. There was a group called the Mexican Dancers that were brought to the studio to perform this sequence. So Disney and his grupo did go to Mexico, but those live action sequences that are set in Mexico are actually shot here with Mexican Americans.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking that, the responses, perhaps I'm thinking right now more on the artists that we include in the show, but some of the earlier artists that we have, I mean, the oldest artists that we have in the show are one artist who is Pedro Friedberg from Mexico City, and then Mel Casas, who's an artist from Texas, actually. And he's a Mexican-American artist whose paintings, I mean, you would see, I mean, he's making this critique of Disney cartoons, right? From a Mexican American perspective, right? I mean, within the context of the United States. So, so I suppose there's
very, very active in the Chicano movement.
Yes.
Mel, right?
Yes. So in that sense, yeah, I guess I would talk more in relation to the artists of the show, but that's something to consider. And of course, as you will see, there's when we come to more contemporary, there's a bigger presence, right?
Okay.
The takeaway for me is really what Maria Angeles has pointed out, which is it's not a one-way, it's not even a two-way, it's really multi-dimensional and very dynamic.
And because your audience is here, it's a three-way, that we get to have a conversation with ourselves and with you guys. So I want to thank our panel for coming out on this Sunday afternoon. Ted, Maria Angeles, Jesse, Ruben. I want to thank you guys for coming out. If you haven't been to the show, it's still open, right? Can you go next door? Is it open till what, 5, 6? I guess you'll find out. Thank you all. Have a great rest.